Can Clemson's Myles Murphy be Atlanta's Cam Jordan? We'll talk about that on today's Mock Draft Monday.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and of course, the most humble host that has ever existed on the planet Earth for this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's not a crisis line. It's not self-help. It's professional therapy done securely online, available to people worldwide. And they have a special offer for my listeners. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. And guys, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube. Help us get to 5,000 subscribers. And you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. And you can also check us out on your Roku or Amazon Fire TV by downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app to check out Locked On Falcons on your Roku or Amazon Fire TV. So, guys, we are officially kicking off the offseason with our first of 11 mock draft Mondays that we will do every single Monday, breaking down a different player that hopefully that is mocked to the Atlanta Falcons with the 8th overall selection. And today we are going to be looking at a 3-round mock draft from Luke Easterling of the Draft Wire at USA Today. And he has the Atlanta Falcons selecting
the 8th pick. The Atlanta Falcons select
defensive end Myles Murphy from Clemson. And Murphy is a player that has been consistently over the last month or two been mocked as a top 5, top 10 sort of player, although we'll talk a little bit later on whether that's going to change by the time we get to April. But he's a good pass rusher, doesn't necessarily have the best bend in the world, not necessarily going to be a speed rusher, but he can win with speed because of his first step quickness, and especially when he can sort of chop those hands of the offensive tackle to sort of get that short edge and turn the corner. He does show good power. He does have a long arm move. He just tends to be a little hot and cold when displaying some of this stuff. And, you know, that's the interesting thing about Murphy. It's like a lot of people come away with either a favorable or unfavorable first impression of him based a lot on sort of what games you watch of his, because some games, like a lot of these Clemson pass rushers, you know, they can be on point and dominant, and then other games they can be very, very quiet. And you're like, how is this guy being mocked in the top 10? Now, when Murphy is on his game, the player that he kind of reminded me of is Cam Jordan, which is a guy with similar size, not necessarily elite burst, but good burst and speed for a guy of his size. But Cam Jordan predominantly wins with power and quick, powerful hands and in a variety of pass rush moves and counters. And I feel like Murphy, if and when he develops in the NFL, will have to win in a similar way. But that type of player obviously would be a pretty good fit in the Falcons defense that we expect Ryan Nielsen, the new defensive coordinator, to incorporate here in Atlanta, be that 3-down player that can play, both as a pass rusher, but also has the size to hold up against the run because, you know, as Murphy mentioned in his introductory press conference last week, he wants to be able to stop the run with light boxes. Right, with 6-man boxes, and you need, bigger, more physical defensive linemen to hold up and maintain their gap discipline. That's not necessarily something that, Murphy does at a high level right now, but I think certainly has the potential to develop that. We'll see where he measures in at the combine, about 6'5", 270 plus. I've seen some indicators that he has nearly 34-inch arms. So he checks the boxes from a physical, in length standpoint. My expectation for his combine testing is I don't think he'll do great in the agility drills that, traditionally you want with those sort of bend the edge sort of pass rushers, but in terms of the explosiveness, the 40 time, those types of drills, broad jump, he should test well in those. And if he does, and that should, be a strong indicator of him, checking those boxes from a physical standpoint. Now, one of the concerns with Murphy is, there hasn't been a lot of success from Clemson edge rushers in the NFL. And a listener in the Discord expressed these concerns. That is from Mr. Walker 713. He says, I know you're not supposed to scout the helmet, but does the lack of NFL production by Clemson pass rushers affect your thoughts on Myles Murphy? And the answer for me is no. And this is referring specifically to edge rushers because the interior guys, Dexter Lawrence, DJ Reader, Grady Jarrett, etc., have gone on to be very fine. Christian Wilkins also would fit in that camp. But the edge guys, Vic Beasley, Shaq Lawson, Daquan Bowers, Kevin Dodd, Cleveland Farrell, several of these guys over the last, 10, 15 years have not quite lived up to their billing. Andre Branch and probably a couple other names I could name did not quite live up to their billings, although some of those guys have turned into solid NFL players. But in terms of being like dominant, top 10 caliber picks, in first round caliber picks, obviously some of those guys have not quite lived up to that. But I feel like you have to kind of take these things at a case by case basis, and you have to look at the reasons why some of those guys failed and why some of those guys may have had some success, and you have to then apply that lens to Murphy. And I have no real insight into why Kevin Dodd failed or Cleveland Farrell failed. I can wax poetic about Vic Beasley, but I think Murphy and Beasley are very different players, so I wouldn't hold that too much against Murphy. But he is going to be a player that I do think is going to need refinement and development at the next level. As I said, I think he's going to have to become a much more technical pass rusher that's going to win with good hand usage and all those various things, just because I don't think he can just sort of line up and win from a pure physical standpoint. I think he's a good athlete, but I don't think he's on that level where he's just going to out athlete guys like a Trayvon Walker or a Ziggy Ansah, that type of athlete at the next level. But we'll see if he lives up to that. When it comes to the combine and whatnot. And I think the one concern you have about Myles Murphy is he going to be kind of a lead dog pass rusher in the NFL, right? I think the potential is there, but only with the development, right? Because he wasn't consistently that at Clemson. And some of that is owed to the fact that Clemson had good pass rushers around him. So, it is not necessarily a knock on him if you watch a game and he's not the best pass rusher on the field, because there's other guys that are more than capable of being successful NFL players that can, sort of step up in that. But he did not lead the team in pressures this past year. He barely led the team in pressures the previous year. And so is he more of a second or third guy? And is that guy really worth a top 10 pick? That, I think, is a fair question. And it just kind of depends on whether or not you believe that, what Murphy is today is him close to his ceiling, or do you feel like there's a lot more potential there in terms of where he can develop that refinement and whatnot. So, we'll see if the Falcons, how high he's going to be on the Falcons board. We know, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that there is a coaching connection between, Myles Murphy and the Falcons coaching staff, because his Clemson's defensive tackles coach, as well as their run game coordinator, is Nick Eason. And Eason served as assistant in the Tennessee Titans organization, overlapping with Arthur Smith for about 4 years from 2014 to 2017. And we've seen in the past with players like Kyle Pitts and Darren Hall and Desmond Ridder and Troy Anderson that, a lot of these draft picks that the Falcons wind up making are kind of coach driven. They're like 1 or 2 degrees removed, where it's like, okay, I worked with this coach. I got the inside scoop on that. So I expect Arthur Smith and company to be able to get the inside scoop on Murphy and some of these other Clemson pass rushers because of that coaching connection with Nick Eason. And if they basically deem that, Murphy checks the athletic boxes and the makeup boxes that they want in a 3-down defensive end to be that sort of Cam Jordan type of player, I could certainly see the Falcons pulling the trigger on Myles Murphy at pick 8. Although I wouldn't sit here today and tell you that he's the likeliest of their draft picks. I'd probably rank him 4th behind guys like Witherspoon, the Illinois corner, Christian Gonzalez, the Oregon cornerback, or Tyree Wilson, the Texas Tech edge rusher. And I'm sure those are 3 other players that we will talk about on these mock draft Mondays over the course of the next couple of weeks and months. But we'll wrap up the mock draft Monday of today's portion by just mentioning the two other players that Luke Easterling projected the Falcons to take in his mock draft in rounds 2 and 3. He had them taking Maryland cornerback Deonte Banks in round 2 and Pittsburgh D tackle Kalijah Kancey in round 3. I haven't watched Banks yet, but he has been getting some recent buzz as a potential first round type of corner. So we'll revisit him at a later date once I've sat down and watched him. Obviously, I've seen a lot of Kalijah Kancey over the years. Very good pass rusher. Probably a little too undersized to really think he's going to make a ton of sense for the Falcons. Because we'll see what he measures at the combine, but it wouldn't shock me if he's like 5'11", 277 or something like that. And that's just that's not big enough to be an every down player in this scheme. And there just isn't a rich history of like situational interior pass rushers having long successful careers in the NFL. So while I'm a big fan of Kancey, I do wonder a little bit about what is his ceiling as an NFL player moving forward. But that may be a topic we revisit at a later date. But that will do it, guys, for our mock draft Monday portion of today's episode. We'll continue to answer some mailbag questions, including whether or not Patrick Peterson is a viable replacement candidate for Casey Hayward at cornerback, and sort of what can you use to tell the elite quarterbacks that truly deserve to be paid the highest amount of money versus the kind of good ones that don't necessarily live up to those enormous quarterback contracts. And we'll get into all of that, guys, as we continue today's episode. But I want to tell you that today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a product that I've used myself for the last 6 months, and I love that it's flexible and convenient and affordable and entirely done online. And all you guys have to do if you want to check out BetterHelp is you can just fill out a quick questionnaire and you'll be matched with a licensed therapist within 48 hours. And I love the convenience of being able to message my therapist at any point in time. And I love that BetterHelp is a lot more affordable than traditional offline therapy, and financial aid is also available. And one of the things that I've learned over the last 6 months in using BetterHelp that my therapist has worked with me is better coping skills, right? Where I am trying to understand that the things that I can control are only the things that I can control. And stressing about things that are out of my control isn't something that is really going to help me moving forward. And that has made things a lot easier for me in a lot of different walks of life. It has empowered my life. And if you want to have a similarly empowered life, right, you can get there with therapy. So just visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So continuing today's episode to answer a couple of mailbag questions. Our first one comes from AJ Evans, I believe. His email was, there has been some rumblings about Patrick Peterson possibly going to the Falcons. He had a productive year, but due to his age, he might be another Casey Hayward. Is there a CB2 in free agency you're eyeing to be the next next to AJ Terrell? You're the second Falcon fan that I've heard mention Patrick Peterson. It's always fascinating to me, how you tell what circles you run in like Falcons Twitter and other places. Cause like, there'll be like some people that are like really focused on like a specific player and like, ew, no. So my answer to Patrick Peterson is like, ew, gross. No, I don't want that. 3 years ago, Patrick Peterson made sense for the Falcons, but like now it's like, no. So in terms of like CB2s, like, go get the top guys. If you're gonna spend money in this offseason on cornerback, then go get Jamel Dean or go get James Bradbury. To me, anybody else really doesn't make any sense. Let's move on to a Discord question from Spacebar. He says, I'm sure you've noticed the trend of quarterbacks on rookie contracts making deep playoff runs. With all the conversation about what paying a top quarterback entails, I think the problem for teams going forward is distinguishing truly top guys versus the guys that are more a product of the talent around them. How would you make that determination as to the haves and have-nots of a top quarterback if you have a relatively stacked team around them? How do you just distinguish the Joe Burrows of the world from the Dak Prescotts And he put in parentheses, I didn't bring up Mahomes because it's kind of obvious. So, this is an interesting question. And to answer your question, I don't think there is like, I don't have a good answer for you, because it's like, it when you see it. Like, you watch a quarterback play, and if he's good, he's good. If he's not, he's not, right? That's what makes evaluating quarterbacks so difficult, because there isn't some sort of like, oh, well, if you see X, then he's good. And if you see Y, then he's not, what I would respond to is, I think the Dak backlash / slander after his poor performance against the 49ers has gone a little bit too far. Like, Dak is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Is he on Joe Burrow's level? No. Is he on Mahomes' level? No, but he's probably a tier below those guys. And, that's probably a legit top 7 quarterback in the NFL. But, like, when it comes to paying these quarterbacks, like, you have to ask your question, like to me, Dak is every bit as good a quarterback, if not better a quarterback, than Matt Ryan was. And you got to ask yourself the question of, like, even if we're like, are you going to not pay a guy because he's not Joe Burrow, even though that that, like, year after year you're going to be a playoff contender, and that's basically what the Cowboys have been, even if they haven't had the playoff success that they would like to have. Dak is probably the main reason why they have been a team that has been to the playoffs multiple times over the last 3-4 years. So, like, if you're sitting here going like, don't pay that guy because he's not as good as Joe Burrow, good luck with that. Good luck finding another guy that can keep you in consistent playoff contention. And that's the problem that happens with the Matt Ryans and the Dak Prescotts of the world. If you're going to distinguish those guys from the guys that need to have a stacked team around them, they're not going to be able to put you on their back and carry you to a Super Bowl most years, right? Now, maybe one year they get hot and they get lucky, similar to what Joe Flacco did when the Ravens won the Super Bowl that one year he had, where he just was lights out. Similar to Eli Manning. Like, Eli Manning got hot twice in the postseason and won 2 Super Bowls, and outside of that was a pretty average NFL quarterback. So, like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, you got to do something, right? So you can either let those guys walk and hope that the next guy you come in is significantly better, or you pay those guys and just hope that you figure it out, and you hope that you get that Kyle Shanahan type of play caller that's going to come in and really take your overall talent level, get the most out of your talent level, so that you don't necessarily have to have the most stacked roster around your guy in order to win. That's a big reason to me why, Sean McVay and Matt Stafford was able to win a Super Bowl last year, because Sean McVay was that sort of, I wouldn't call it equalizer, but, that sort of X factor that pushed that team over the top, in addition, to having, one of the better defenses in the NFL with some of the playmakers that they have there. But it's just something you have to deal with. Like, that's the price of success, getting a good quarterback, but not a great quarterback. And, so I hope that answers your question. So we will leave it at that, and we'll wrap up today's episode, giving you my thoughts on the Super Bowl, right? Full disclosure, I'm recording this part before I've actually watched the game, so maybe there will be a wardrobe change at some point coming back on today's episode, but we'll get my thoughts on the Super Bowl coming up. And I don't know exactly what those are as I say these things. But before we get into all of that, guys, I do want to remind you that now that the Super Bowl has been played, NFL season is now officially over, but we are at the midway point in the NBA season, and this is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, because new customers get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. All you got to do is download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, super easy to use, and you can bet on anything from money line to point spreads. I love the same game parlays, right? I love to bet a little and potentially win a lot. And FanDuel has a great, cool feature that is called a parlay builder. And especially with the NBA, like, I can now use it to select certain players that I think will get a certain amount of points and assists and rebounds, put them all in one parlay and hope that, they win big for me. And you can do it too. So don't miss your chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 and bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. So we are back to wrap up Super Bowl 56 with the Kansas City Chiefs emerging victorious over the Philadelphia Eagles. Great game, great performance by Riri. Love that woman. The game was everything I wanted it to be. Back and forth type of game. Mahomes stepping up, Jalen Hurts stepping up. Both those guys really made plays, runs, throws at the end of the game to really put their teams in a position to win. Unfortunately, I do think the game will be marred a little bit by the questionable call on James Bradberry at the end, possible future Falcon, as discussed earlier on today's episode. And that's unfortunate, that the officiating continues to be a part of the conversation. And I just think that's just the new normal in the NFL. And it's unfortunate, but it is what it is. Other than that, I think looking at this game, if I'm not necessarily a huge fan of overreacting to the team that wins the Super Bowl as like, oh, they have the magic formula and blueprint to success. But I do think when you look at this game itself, and the reason for that is mostly because like we overrate the one team that wins the Super Bowl and we underrate the 3 or 4 other teams that easily had a couple of breaks gone their way, could have easily been hoisting up that trophy. Is the reason why I tend not to try to put too much stock in the Super Bowl. But I do think this game does a good job of illustrating the notion that investing in your trenches is never a bad thing, right? Philadelphia doesn't get probably to this game without their pass rush being as formidable as it was. And Kansas City, doesn't win this game if their offensive line isn't as good. And we saw them lose the Super Bowl a couple of years ago in large part due to them getting dominated in the trenches. They went out and invested the resources to fix that problem with the offensive line. And now you see it manifest itself with, a team like Kansas City without their, big, sexy pass catcher or I was gonna say some weird stuff. I was gonna say like Tyreek Hill is not big, probably nor sexy. But what I'm saying. I'm sorry, guys. Losing it at the end of this. But yeah, like Philadelphia went out, invested in AJ Brown, and that was a big reason why they were able to get there. And Jalen Hurts' improvement, and we've talked about the Eagles a little bit as the model for the Falcons to kind of copy, and building up the rest of the talent and hoping that as you build up the rest of your roster to get it to being a playoff caliber roster, regardless of the quarterback, you can grow your quarterback and develop your quarterback to the point that, in a year or two, you can feel pretty good about, a Desmond Ridder type of quarterback, taking your team pretty far in the postseason. But obviously time will tell on that, and we'll see what the investments the Falcons make. I think this game illustrates that you can't get complacent when it comes to your offensive line. Falcons, keep that in mind. So we'll, no other real thoughts on the game itself, guys. I'm sure something else that you guys are screaming at your phones, be like, why don't you talk about this? Like, I don't know. So we'll be back tomorrow with a special teams review to break down the special teams unit. And we'll talk, I guess we'll talk about Avery Williams and, whether or not he's the guy that can replace Cordero Patterson and be that big play threat. We saw a punt return in this game, sort of be a big factor in why the Chiefs were able to win, getting that sort of big play. And is Avery Williams that type of guy? Yeah, so we'll talk about that and probably other things on the special teams review. And I don't think we have to spend a ton of time on Young Koo and the Highlander, Liam McCullough. So we'll see. I guess we'll talk about Bradley Pennington. So that is in store for tomorrow's episode. We will probably do another mailbag at some point this week, and probably we'll get a guest on at some point later this week as well. And then we might start up Free Agent Fridays. And I think right now I'm leaning towards that being maybe a Salary Cap 101 episode where we can break down sort of, the rules and regulations behind the salary cap, some clear up some misconceptions. Yeah, some misconceptions about the salary cap. So that may be in store on later this week as well. So make sure you make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Of course, free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including on YouTube. And make sure you check out Locked On Sports Atlanta on the same podcast platforms, including on YouTube. Check out Locked On Braves, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs. Check out Locked On NFL. You got new hosts at the Locked On NFL Draft podcast. So go check out Locked On NFL Draft, guys. Keith Sanchez, Damian Pearson, coming at you from the Draft Network to the Locked On NFL Draft podcast. So go check those guys out as they start up, I believe, this week. Make them your second listen after you've made Locked On Falcons your first listen. But guys, I'm done talking. Appreciate it. Till then, hope you had a great Super Bowl weekend. We got so much off season in store for you guys coming up, all for the next 9 months or however long it is. So yeah, that's it, guys. Appreciate it. Till then.